Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is DreadBC. This is my Arcanis the Omnipotent EDH deck. The idea for this is not a unique one. None of the cards in here are probably going to be much that you haven't seen before, but this is the list that I've comprised that works well for me. Feel free to make suggestions if you like them. Arcanus, there's not much really to say about him. He's an efficiently costed creature. He is only a 3/4, but you generally aren't using him to attack. If he's turning sideways, his best ability is to draw you 3 cards. It's an Ancestral Recall that doesn't even cost the 1 blue mana. Once you cast him the one time, if you untap with him, it's very difficult to lose. If you untap twice with him, you almost always win. The returning him to your hand at instant speed ability, while not irrelevant completely, doesn't come into play that much. Sometimes it's good to not have to play him for 10 or 12 mana if he's died a few times, so good to have, but not always necessary. So with that, let's go ahead and get into what the rest of the deck is made of. So let's get to the mana base. Now this deck runs a ton of islands. I run 32 basic islands. 32. And the reason I run basic islands is because I have artifacts that increase the efficacy of these islands. They will end up tapping for blue or triple blue or sometimes 4 and 5 at a time, but there obviously are other lands that you absolutely must have. Well, I won't say absolutely must, but it's still good to have them. Academy Ruins is one of them. Great when people start destroying your artifacts. You don't want them to do that, so you go ahead and put them back on top of your library. If you want to draw it again, this keeps your mana artifacts going. There's a couple of creature or artifact creatures in here that this saves as well. For the most part, though, it's to save your big boosters. To let's see, Halimar Depths, another one of those cards you love to play at any time. Turn one, making sure that your next 3 card draws come in smoothly. Great. Make sure you draw your lands when you need to. The only downside is if you are playing this as your last land in hand and hoping to draw a land on the next turn and not seeing one, you're sort of seeing that your fate is sealed. But at the same time, more information is always better. Talaria West comes into play tapped, only adds a blue to your pool, but honestly, those two things have been completely irrelevant. I've never once put Talaria West into play. This card might as well be a sorcery that reads 1 blue, discard this card, and search your library for Reliquary Tower. With your general, Reliquary Tower is a completely unbeatable land. Having no maximum hand size and drawing 4+ cards per turn is absolutely broken. Love this card. You cannot, well, I won't say you can't play the deck without it, but you should not play this deck without it. Now, most of the artifacts in this deck are actually just mana artifacts with the exception of one, so we'll go ahead and start out with the Ever-Flowing Chalice. This is another one of those cards you can play it on turn 2 and it's good. You can play it on turn 10 and it's a little bit overkill, but at the same time it gives you more breathing room later on. It's not quite as powerful as Sol Ring. If you have a commander deck, you need to be running Sol Ring now. There's no reason not to. It's no longer an incredibly expensive card. You can get them for dirt cheap. I've never once played a game where this was in my opening hand and lost that game. This card is that powerful. When you're tapping for 4 mana on turn 2, even green decks can't compete. This is the only non-mana artifact. This is Temple Bell. It's a little bit of a diplomacy play, but at the same time, this is a win condition. There's another card in this deck that I'll get to in just a moment. Many of you already know what it is. It's an instant win con unless anyone can answer one of these two. Extraplanar Lens. This is the one of the 3 cards in the deck that increases the efficacy of my islands. You exile one with this, they now tap for blue. Now the downside to this one being that all islands tap for blue, but that can also be an upside because you're playing the diplomacy game. You're allowing other people to do extra stuff with their lands as well, so they don't just outright hate you for ramping. Thran Dynamo, very efficiently costed mana ability here. It only costs 4 to play. I know the glare is catching that. I'll remove these so the next ones hopefully don't get glared as bad. Adding 3 to your mana pool with it, you can play the Thran Dynamo and then immediately tap 3 and play the Extraplanar Lens with it. I've done that play more than once. At the same time, you can play a lot of other things, but that's just one of the things that comes to mind. Very, very strong. Almost always want to include that in just about any deck unless you're running too many colors to use it. If you are running too many colors, I suggest using Gilded Lotus, because at least Gilded Lotus allows you to tap for colors. Another one that I want to include in just about every deck that I play. I've never casted Gilded Lotus and felt bad about the way I spent my mana. Gauntlet of Power is similar to the Extra Planar Lens with the added bonus of giving all blue creatures +1/+1. And I say blue, you can choose a different color if you want to, but you're not gonna. It just doesn't happen. And Cage Sun, you're paying an extra mana for it. Your blue creatures are getting an additional 1/1. But however, whenever a land's ability adds one or more mana to your mana pool, you add an extra of that color. Now, this is a little bit different. It allows that Halimar Depths. It allows any non-basic lands that tap for blue to add an extra blue to your pool as well. So not only does it only affect you, but it affects all of your lands a little bit better. Great card. Always will include this. Artifacts aside, we always know what we want to play once we get a whole bunch of mana, and that is we want to start cranking out those Planeswalkers. The Planeswalkers that I play, I only play 6 of them right now, although I might be ramping it up to 7 here soon. We'll start out with Jace Beleren. Baby Jace, the original Jace, one of the first 5 Planeswalkers, one of the best balanced Planeswalkers. His ultimate ability is almost irrelevant because so many people run the old Eldrazi nowadays that milling is rarely an option. Um, the plus ability is really good with Consecrated Sphinx. I'll be getting to that card here in a little bit. Plus, it's again part of that diplomacy play that you want to do, where you don't have everybody just hating you outright for drawing extra cards. Now, when you're playing one Jace, you might as well go ahead and play 2 Jaces, since the value of this card hasn't necessarily plummeted, but that you can now get a foil one for the same price that when they were in standard, a regular one was costing. You might as well go ahead and get him as well. Jace the Mind Sculptor is the do-it-all card. It takes care of creatures. It allows you to draw extra. It allows you to shuffle away bad cards if you've got ways to get cards into your to shuffle your library after you put 2 cards back. And once you start fate sealing someone, especially in a one-on-one match, it just gets real ugly for them from there. Tamayo or Tamayo, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the Moon Sage. Gotta love this card. Her +1 ability is the most relevant, tapping down a permanent so it doesn't untap. It's a good way for blue to do its pseudo removal job. Blue's always kind of had a hard time dealing with creatures until the recent years. You could gain control of them, or you could just never allow them into play. But once they are in play, it's a little more of a red, white, or black thing to get rid of them. But in this case, you can tap them down and they don't untap. Now, that does say tap target permanent, so artifacts that are posing a threat as well. You've got Mind Slavers, you've got huge mana artifacts, like if someone were to cast an Everflowing Chalice for 5 or 6, well, guess what? Now they don't get to use that. Plus, you're working toward that amazing emblem of being able to exile, or I'm sorry, to being able to never have a maximum hand size and to just cast spells over and over again. Tezzeret the Seeker has probably proven to be the most powerful on his own. His ramp abilities allow me to play the larger costed spells in this deck. The best targets for it, obviously, are the a really large Everflowing Chalice is one, but Thran Dynamo and Gilded Lotus, just fantastic. The -X, usually you'll use it for 3 to get an extra planar lens or to get the Everflowing Chalice, especially if you're going all out and winning on the next turn. The -5 ability, I've never once used in this deck. That's not to say you can't use it, it's just you generally don't have enough artifacts that doing that is going to make a huge difference. But again, it probably won't come into play too much. Use them for mana, use them for tutoring, and you're good to go. Karn Liberated, as I said before, blue has that issue with removal, so his -3 ability is great if you put it into play. His +4 ability is not completely irrelevant. The -14 ability, I've never liked Sherazade effects. Restarting the game just seems it's I don't know. It's not as fun to me as it is to others. I'm sure when your opponent has to shuffle all that he's worked for away as well, and now you start the game with so much on your board. Obviously, it's meant to be an ultimate. It's meant to help you win easily, but it's not as enjoyable to me. Do it as you wish, but this is one that I chose to run for the exile factor. And the final Planeswalker, Ugin the Spirit Dragon. Again, +3, that's the +2 is 3 damage, nice removal. The -X, exiling each permanent with cost X or less, that's one or more colors, that is incredible. The fact that you can pay 8 and do this for 7 immediately is a huge wipe. You can still plus him and do it for 9 later on and get some of the really, really big creatures, but generally you're not going to need to. Of course, now in this deck, if you're tapping for 8, you're doing pretty well anyway. You're probably casting a lot of things, but all of his abilities are relevant. All of his abilities are great. He does cost 8, but he's still great. All right, the next thing I'm going to include here is our instant spells, starting with the cheapest, Brainstorm. I I like this card on turn one, but it's you can use it anytime. You never feel bad drawing this card because it's a little mini ancestral recall if you have cards in hand. Um, just great. Costs exactly what it needs to. Well, probably costs less than it needs to. Love this card. Used to run fetch lands as a side note. I took them out for poor reasons. One of them being that they're way too expensive to get in foil. Another one being that I had too few lands as it was, and thinning became an issue. But I started to work out things a little bit to where it wasn't so bad. I still might put them back in, but if you have fetch lands, it makes Brainstorm that much more powerful. Deprive is Counterspell's slightly weaker brother. Cost the same, but you do return a land to your hand. Now, once you have the artifacts out that make your lands tap for extra mana, generally returning one to your hand isn't a huge deal because the others are going to be tapping for a whole lot more. Tapping out for a Deprive on turn 2 is very rarely a good option. Most of the things played on turn 2 don't need to be countered that bad, but in an emergency, this is a great, efficiently costed counterspell. But if you're running that, you might as well go ahead and just run counterspell. Gotta love it. No flavor text, nothing. Just says counter target spell. Wonderful card. Muddle the Mixture is a great little card to have, not just for the countering abilities. In fact, I rarely use it for that. Most of the time, I'm tutoring up one of my 2-drop creatures. Now, we're going to get to creatures here in a little bit, but it's always good to have the option of countering an instant or sorcery spell, especially if someone's about to go infinite and start taking a bunch of turns. I always love cards that give you multiple options. Transmute is the one I just normally use. Stoic Rebuttal is counterspell +1, but with Metalcraft you don't necessarily have to pay that one. I can honestly say I've never once casted it for its Metalcraft cost, but in this era we're so used to playing with cards like Cancel, which is also included in here, that there's no reason not to go ahead and run this one as well. It's not to say that you wouldn't ever get the Metalcraft in this deck, it's just that I haven't been lucky enough to do so. While we're talking about the 3-mana counter spells, Dream Fracture, the Diplomacy play, I've countered your spell, but that's okay. You get to draw a card, I draw a card, everybody draws a card, it feels great. Another reason to run this is because the artwork is amazing. I don't know if it's easy enough to see, but I just always loved the way this card looked. Turnabout might get replaced. It functions as an infinite mana combo with a couple of other things I'll explain later. We'll get to that in just a minute. But as it is a pretty good card so far as having multiple options. As I said, I do like having options. Being able to untap my artifacts for extra mana in case I need to cast a big fatty a couple of turns early is great. Or later on when I can untap all my lands, which are tapping for 4 mana apiece, and just tap something or tap out for something enormous or several small things. This card has come in handy. Still trying to contemplate whether or not I want to keep it. Another reason is it has not been printed in a way that I can ever get it in foil, and as you may notice, I do enjoy having things in foil. Fact or Fiction, a very, very efficient draw spell, and also puts into your opponent's hand a decision of their own fate. They have to decide which 2 cards they can't let you have at the same time, and then the other ones they have to split evenly among those usually. Sometimes they'll see one card that's going to absolutely ruin them, and your choice is to either draw that card or 4 others. And it's up to you at that point. But this one, the fact that it's instant speed card draw makes it great. The fact that it's instant speed, you usually can end up drawing 3, or at the very least, usually 2. This card has always been good to cast. I've never cast it and felt bad about it. Rewind, I love as a counterspell in multiplayer games especially, because it allows you to counter something on the second player's turn and then untap and maybe counter something on the third player's turn. It doesn't make you super popular, but the it's always possible to do this. Now, another option is you can counter something meaningless of yours if you want to untap extra lands and get more mana out of it. This is something that I have done one time before. People were wondering why I was countering my own stuff, and then they saw that I was tapping for an additional 8 mana because I did that. So it gives you, once again, more options, and again, instant speed, always good. Bone to Ash I included because I play against people who play a lot of creatures. And if you're playing against someone who plays a lot of creatures, this is almost as good as Cryptic Command. Now, Cryptic Command is the card that does it all. You can counter a creature, you can tap creatures, you can return permanents to their owner's hands and then draw a card. This one is a mini version of that. It's a little bit easier to cast, but in a mono blue deck, obviously, that's not a problem. I decided to run both of them in this deck. They have both performed pretty well. If I were to replace one, it would be Bone to Ash, obviously. But so far, I haven't had the opportunity to find anything too much better. Mindbreak Trap is great. I've never casted it for the 0 cost before. I don't play against anybody who plays Storm in EDH or anything like that, but I suppose there's someone out there who might give it a try, just no one that I've come across. I will say that I have countered an uncounterable creature with this. Exiling something is great to get around that ability. This cannot be countered. That doesn't say it cannot be exiled. And the final is just the X draw spell, Blue Sun Zenith. A lot of folks don't like this one because the triple blue cost, but in this deck, that its instant speed means at the end of someone's turn, you can probably end up pulling about 7 or 8 cards out of your library. You just generate so much mana in so little time. Really enjoy this card, and it shuffles back into your library, so you can often do it more than one time in a game. They're not quite as fast as instants, but they're still quite powerful. Let's get to the sorceries. Start with Ponder, another one of those cards that's pretty good to play on turn 1. Again, you never really feel bad drawing it later in the game because you're still going to be looking at 3 more cards. Whether or not you're going to keep them is up to you. This is great when you want to shuffle things away. It's good when it's good anytime. I've never cast this. I say this a lot, but I've never cast this and felt bad, especially for 1 mana. If there was a draw spell in this deck that I would like to replace most, it would probably be Mind Spring. The fact that it's a sorcery speed makes up for the fact that it costs 1 less than the other X spell that we have, Blue Sun Zenith. It's that much worse that I kind of want to replace it, but at the same time, I have cast this a couple of times for 1 or 2 cards just when I'm digging for mana, and I usually am thankful that I did. I keep it in because the amount of mana this deck produces, it is another option of drawing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 cards at a time. So it's still there for now. I might replace it in the future, but as it is, I like it. Fabricate is a go-to card for me. Absolutely fantastic. Great in almost any deck that runs blue because you should be running artifacts if you're playing EDH. This one does search for a win condition in Temple Bell. It searches for your mana ramp if you get a little bit behind. It can search for a big fat creature. Like I said, we'll get to those. This card is great. Savor the Moment is less broken in this deck than others because I only run so few Planeswalkers, but even still, if I can pay 3 mana and I can use it like it is just an Explorer, I don't untap anything, but I can still maybe swing with a creature the next turn if I need to, or use my 1 Planeswalker's ability. That's great. But if all I'm doing with it is drawing a card and playing an extra land, it's still okay. That being said, if I do get 2 or 3 Planeswalkers in play, this is one of the best draws ever because it only costs 3 mana. Rite of Replication has been an absolute MVP in this deck. Most of the time I'm targeting my own creatures, although I have played a few games where I've targeted someone else's creatures and they just tapped out for a big fatty and you just tapped out for 5 of that big fatty. So You know, they walk their guy into a funhouse mirror, or a maze of mirrors, and they now see a bunch of their own guys staring back at them. Never fun. But most of the time, I use this to go infinite with extra turns. I'll explain that when I get to the creatures. Speaking of extra turns, here's my extra turn package. On top of the Savor the Moment, we've got Time Warp, and we've got his big brother Time Stretch. Always know what you're playing against, because if someone were to change the target, both of these say target player, someone can change the target of these and switch it to themselves. Hitting one of these with that can really turn the game against you, but if they don't, you're getting ahead. The last of the sorceries is Curse of the Swine. As I've said, blue has a hard time dealing with creatures if you're not stealing control of them. This is another good way to do that. It feels like a very white ability. You're exiling creatures. You're exiling X creatures at that. Now, the downside is that you are giving them 2/2s, but what does that matter, honestly? You have 40 life. A 2/2 is not going to do anything to you. I originally contemplated on putting the enchantments in the deck last, because one of them is the biggest win condition of the deck. Another one is just an absurdly powerful card, but I think I'm going to go ahead and get these down here first. Light Line of Anticipation, I've had some folks tell me, is probably a good one. That if I were to ever replace a card, it would be to replace this one. Except that when I cast this and I start doing everything on the opponent's turn, I have so much more control of the game that way. It just feels great. I have started with this in play a couple of times. That it being in your opening hand ability is not irrelevant. Mind Control I usually use on commanders. There are a number of times I have hit other creatures with it, but for the most part I'm trying to steal people's commanders when they're trying to do mean things. This is a bit of a cruel move, but at the same time, this is not a game where you're trying to play to lose. You're playing to win. Volition Reigns is another one often used on commanders, but at the same time, I really rather enjoy stealing Planeswalkers with this one. Controlling any permanent is always another one of those ones that opens your options for you. Planeswalkers are my favorite. Generals are just another good side effect of this one. The biggest win condition of this deck, mind over matter. The only negative thing I can say about this card, and I tell you it is a minor one, is that you cannot get it in foil as of right now. This card is broken. With your general, you draw 3 cards, you discard one of them, draw 3 cards, discard one of those, you draw infinite. With that, you can get all the way down through your deck and get your Temple Bell. With this plus Temple Bell is an instant win combination. You untap Temple Bell, you make everyone draw. You untap Temple Bell, you make everyone draw, you mill everyone out. Some of you knew exactly that this card was going to be in the deck as soon as you saw Temple Bell, some of you didn't. That's the combo. The other one is sort of you're drawing 4 cards a turn, now you're casting them all for free. Omniscience, it's just broken. This deck casts it without too much trouble within 6 or 7 turns usually. Once this is in play, you cannot lose. If this again, there's several cards like it, but if this goes unanswered, it's over. Now, this being a blue deck, it's not generally thought of that blue is a very creature-centric color, but I do run a lot of creatures in this deck. One of them that a lot of folks don't ever see coming is Dreamscape Artist. This is a very green ability. Now, the discard a card part of this is wholly irrelevant when you talk about the fact that you're drawing 3 extra cards per turn. Most of the time, you're going to be drawing at least 1 land in those, and lands are irrelevant at that point because you're putting so many in play. This helps you filter more and more lands out of your deck. You're playing Harrow on a stick every turn. He's a 1/1. I've never attacked with him, but once again, beautiful art. Absolutely love the art on this card, and he's got great flavor text. It says he has mastered the art of sleight of land. Wonderful. Lighthouse Chronologist, another one of those unanswered cards. It's game over if someone doesn't get this off the field once it hits 7 counters, especially in a multiplayer game where you're taking a turn for everyone else's turn plus your own. That means in a 3-player game, you're playing 3 turns to their 1. Yeah, that gets out of hand very quickly. He's only a 1/3, so he dies to a lot of things. He doesn't have any protection. He becomes a 3/5, even still, has very little protection of his own. But you're playing blue. You're supposed to counter things that are targeting this guy. Treasure Maze generally gets Two different things in this deck. He's got 3 or 4 options, but the only ones that I get usually are Cage Sun, or sometimes I'll get Steel Hellkite. For the most part, Cage Sun is his go-to. I need mana. I always like to have him in play. Plus, once again, wonderful looking foil. Love the art on this. Trinket Mage, all that text at the bottom says, when Trinket Mage comes into play, search your library for Soul Ring and put it into your hand. I used to have Seat of the Synod in this deck just in case I had Soul Ring in my hand. It would allow him to search for that, but I found that a basic island has, in its place, has gotten me more value most of the time, so I no longer run it. Clone is another one of those cards that has gone down in value over time in this deck. Cannot kill generals with it anymore like you could with the changes to the legendary rule, but even still, copying generals is still quite good. There are other creatures in this deck that I like to copy with it. There's 2 more clones in here, but they have more options. Clever Impersonator can be any non-land permanent on the battlefield. This is a fun one to steal planeswalkers, especially planeswalkers of a color that you're not playing. And Phyrexian Metamorph, most of the time I use this to target an art or to create a copy of an artifact, especially a mana artifact. If I can get my islands tapping for 3, 4, or 5 apiece, I'm happy. These two I'll display together, Archaeomancer and Mnemonic Wall. They both return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Great for extra turn shenanigans. You can play these, get your time stretch back to your hand, take 2 extra turns after this one. Then you can play a Phyrexian Metamorph, copying one, returning time stretch to your hand. Or, the biggest win con with these is getting a Rite of Replication on them. A Rite of Replication, especially if you kick it, will put 5 of these in play. Now, as that resolves, Rite of Replication is back in your graveyard, and this will return both Rite of Replication and another spell to your hand, as well as 3 others. So, it's not uncommon to have Rite of Replication returned, Time Warp, say, a draw spell, and you just name it. 2 others are there. I go infinite with this a lot. It's a good win condition and a lot of fun. Muldrifter, if you're playing blue and you're not playing Muldrifter, you're doing it wrong. It does cost 5 mana if you want the 2/2, but other than that, it's still a divination, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, options are always good. Teferi, one more of the cards that allows me to play things on another player's turn. The more you can do that, the more in control of the game you are. Rather enjoy playing this guy. He looks a little bit like Lawrence Fishburne in this artwork, so that's kind of neat too. Looks a little bit like Morpheus, but not sure what he's wearing. Even still, Flash is good. Opponents cannot cast anything during your turn. That's even better. Your stuff is not going to get countered. More protection. Another win condition, I don't know how many I've put in here, so I've stopped trying to count. Psychosis Crawler. One of the ones that was a little bit of a sleeper before EDH really went up in popularity. This guy, he can get huge, but I don't generally turn him sideways too much. You don't have to. That's one of those abilities that you don't use it much because he's chump blockable. However, every time you draw a card, all of your opponents lose a life. This is a quicker way of ending the game with the Temple Bell Mind Over Matter combo. You draw, everyone loses, everyone takes a damage, and you just keep doing that over and over again. When you're drawing 4 cards a turn, he's hitting everybody for 4 a turn, and it's not singling anybody out. Now, you can attack with him. Obviously, you're going to want to every time you get to, but that's almost irrelevant because, like I said, he's so easily blocked. I'll display both of these together. It was once known as the Pickles combo. You've got the Brine Elemental, and you've got the Vesuvan Shapeshifter. Brine Elemental, when he turns face up, each opponent skips his or her next untap step. Now, it costs a truckload of mana to do that. It is 3 to play it face down, and then 5 blue to turn it up, for a total of 10 mana to keep them from untapping. But once you do that and you play Vesuvan Shapeshifter, he flips every turn and you can pay 1 blue to prevent them from untapping. Now, if that doesn't work out and they manage to kill your Brine Elemental, this guy is still a creature that you can clone something and then clone something else. It's the only resettable clone we have in here, as long as you're not counting returning something to your hand with Jace or Cryptic Command. A good all-around card. The combo I've only ever gotten off one time, and I felt so dirty doing it, I vowed never to do it again. Who knows? The day might come. Steel Hellkite, very powerful abilities. A little bit clunky. He is a 5/5 at the very least, but the X ability, destroying each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn, it's a great ability. I've never used it. Never once. Generally, since he's an artifact, the turn he comes into play, people feel like he's a giant threat, and he is. He can cause problems, but if this does nothing but eat an artifact removal spell and allow me to keep all of my mana artifacts, I'm fine. Consecrated Sphinx, another one of those powerhouses that has gone way up in price since he was first printed. This guy draws so many cards. It's incredible. Jace Beleren plus this guy is a little mini combo. Actually, not just Jace Beleren, but Temple Bell as well. If you're playing, say, in a three-person game, everybody draws a card. That means you draw one, and then you draw two for each of your opponents. So you tap Temple Bell, you draw 5. You plus 2 Jace Beleren, you draw 5. So much value out of this guy. The fact that he's a 4/6 is also nothing to scoff at, and he's a flyer. Another one of the great blue removal spells, Phyrexian Ingester. He's a little bit of a duplicate ability on this one. I like this one. He can be returned to your hand with Jace, so you can do it multiple times. He can be returned with the other, the Cryptic Command. Not a whole lot else that I do with this guy. He's usually a one-time removal, and then he just becomes a nice big fatty. Cataract Leviathan works really well in this deck, especially if you get your Mind Over Matter combo going. If someone were to destroy your Mind Over Matter once you've drawn them into something like a Krosan Grip, you can still play this guy from your graveyard if you have managed to discard him and gain all sorts of advantage with it. The mana cost of your stuff is not as relevant to you because your lands are going to be tapping for so much more. Plus, he's a 5/5. Another sleeper win condition of this deck, Stormtide Leviathan, straight out of the dollar bin. This guy has been a powerhouse. A fantastic thing to hit with Rite of Replication. Putting 5 of this guy into play means that you're swinging for 48 damage, and it's unblockable. He makes everything into an island. Now, beware the interaction of this with the cards that make islands tap for extra mana, because you are going to be ramping everybody, but that's usually not a big deal unless you know they're going to be able to remove this. The other target for our Treasure Mage, Inkwell Leviathan, 7/11 Island Walk Trample is good enough, but he has Shroud. He costs 9 mana. He is an artifact, but he is so big and so strong, and that 11 butt end on him makes him incredibly difficult to deal with. I cannot see myself cutting him from this deck. The original general of this deck was Lorthos, who was then replaced by this guy. I want to get Lorthos back in here, but for now I'm going to leave Jin Gataxius as my secondary big draw guy. Drawing 7 cards at the end of the turn that you play him is great. Flashing him in at the end of an opponent's turn and making them most likely discard their entire hand is even more powerful. It does paint a huge target on him. It paints a huge target on you. That's why he's no longer my general. People see me drawing 3 extra cards a turn. They know that that's a problem. But when I'm drawing 7 extra cards a turn and they can't keep cards at the end of their turn, that's an even bigger problem. The final card in this one is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the original Eldrazi, I suggest you look at all 3 of them. You can run any of them that you like. I'm sorry, Emrakul, I believe, might still be banned, but this guy is still a lot of fun. He's got the synergy with the rest of the deck of drawing 4 cards. Annihilator 4. Annihilator should never have been printed, but it's so strong. It's so ridiculously strong. Not to mention the fact that he's a 12/12. His most relevant ability, however, for those who are wondering about the Temple Bell combo, how do I keep me from milling myself? It's because of this guy. If I put him into my graveyard, even if they remove him from the game as he hits the graveyard, the rest of my graveyard still shuffles in. Now, if they remove the rest of the graveyard, you're going to have to abandon that as a win con and start going the aggro game. But as it is, Kozilek has been fantastic in this one. I don't like Ulamog as much, even though he's indestructible. It's your choice. So yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. A couple of things I want to mention. There are plenty of ways you can go with this deck if you don't like to combo out, or if you've got a table rules or house rules that play with a different meta where you're not allowed to go infinite. You can definitely take this a different way. One of the very first cards that I'm going to be adding to this deck is Laboratory Maniac, because it's another way that the Mind Over Matter card can win without having to worry about hitting everybody else. People just wonder, why is he drawing his entire deck? And then, oh wait, yeah, now he's drawing a card and has no cards in his library. That's game over. Sapphire Medallion, I don't include that one, and again, it's for a stupid reason. It's because I really like foils, and so far as I've seen, you cannot get that in foil. Rhystic Study, another very strong card. A lot of people wonder why I don't run it. I have a lot of card draw anyway. I don't miss that card not being in here. I had it in here for a while. It's been replaced. I don't miss it, but you are welcome to run it if you want to. Same with High Tide. I've got the 3 different mana artifacts that increase the strength of my islands. High Tide was just another way to do that. It's a good card. It can fit in this deck. It has fit in this deck, but it's not necessary. Solemn Simulacrum, I probably am going to figure out a way to fit him in here. He's just a very good value card. There's no reason not to run him except that I don't have one in foil, and once again, that's my gig, is foils. Kira, Great Glass Spinner. I like her ability, but at the same time, I don't like her ability. There are times that I want to cast Rite of Replication on my creatures, and I can't do that because she counters it. That ultimately is why she was removed from this deck. You can run her if you want to. If you don't like the Rite of Replication win condition, go ahead and put her in here. Airtie, Wizard Adept, is another one I'm thinking I might try to get my hands on to try him out in here. Counterspell on a stick, very good. Bone to Ash, as I mentioned earlier, is like a little mini cryptic command, but with the printing of Insidious Will, being able to choose between countering a spell, choosing new targets for a spell, and copying a spell, it's the same mana cost, and it is not limited to only creatures, but losing the card draw I don't think is going to be a huge deal. Insidious Will is a better card, so I'll probably find a way to get that as soon as I can. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions, feel free to let me know. Take care.